So thank you so much, Mr. Breitbart, for helping set this up, and Ken and Pete from representing our board. And to you, Ms. Bundles, thank you so much for the gift of your time. I want to introduce you to our group today. You know our school from a few years ago when you were an amazing graduation speaker, sending off our fifth graders to middle school, where they've been very successful, and they've been following your advice, which was to go and be the best they can and follow the legacy of the luminaries who've walked the same streets and campuses and sidewalks that they walk. So for those of you who don't know Miss Bundles, she's the great granddaughter of Madam C.J. Walker, and that's why she's currently in the news, because of the Netflix series based on her book about the life of that pioneer. But she is a pioneer in her own right, as a journalist, as a producer, as a trailblazer. And so without further ado, I want to turn it over to you for a presentation. Talk to us, share your wisdom with us. And again, thank you, and a wonderful experience for all of us to spend this time with you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Evangelista. I am just delighted to have another chance to connect with folks at Harlem Link. I really enjoyed my time at graduation, and my good friend Ken lets me, tells me what you're doing and sort of keeps me up to date. So I was really glad that he reached out and invited me to participate. And I do have fond memories of that day, not just talking, but also getting a chance to dance and learn a few new steps that I didn't already know because I didn't know them. So I don't know. I think the students who were there for graduation, are they now they're now in high school? Is that, where are they now?
They're in eighth grade now. Yeah.
Great. So anyways, give my best to them and tell them that I really enjoyed meeting them. So good morning, class, and I hope everybody is doing well. This is really a challenging time, and I know that your teachers and administrators and parents really care a lot about you and really want you to keep learning and are trying to make it as interesting as possible. And so I'm glad to know that you are trying to hang in there and be creative about your learning. So this morning, I'm getting an opportunity to talk about Self-Made, the Netflix series that was, as the words are, inspired by my book, because everything in the series is not fact, and a lot of it is made up because it's Hollywood. And I think some of you have seen it. Maybe a few of you have seen the documentary, the nonfiction documentary, $2 and a Dream. That is on YouTube. And if you haven't, maybe at some point, later in the summer, you'll get a chance to watch that. But I thought I would start by reading something from this book that I wrote for young readers, for 4th to 7th grade readers, called All About Madam C.J. Walker. So I'm going to read for about 10 minutes or so. So I hope everybody will follow along. And if you've seen the Netflix series or read any of the other books, some of this may think, did that really happen? I didn't see that in the Netflix series, but these are the facts that are in this book. So here's the preface. Madam C.J. Walker was one of the most successful American businesswomen of the early 20th century. She is remembered as an entrepreneur and pioneer of the modern hair care industry. She also made her mark as a philanthropist, a patron of the arts, and a political activist who spoke out against racial injustice. Walker had very humble beginnings. She was born Sarah Breedlove on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana in 1867, 2 years after the end of the Civil War. Her parents, Owen and Minerva Breedlove, died when she was just 7 years old. As a child, she had almost no formal education. She married at a very young age and was widowed when she was 20. In 1888, she and her 3-year-old daughter, Lelia, moved to St. Louis, where her older brothers were barbers. She joined St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church and met very kind female church members who helped her adjust to the city. She never forgot their generosity. The example they set became a model for her own philanthropy. Walker worked as a laundress for many years and made very little money, but she was determined to give her daughter more opportunities than she had had for herself. There is an old saying that necessity is the mother of invention. This certainly was true for Walker. She was losing her hair because of a severe scalp infection and was desperate for a cure for her bald spots. She often said that her formula came to her in a dream after she prayed for a solution. But she also took the advice from others until she finally came up with the right combination of ingredients. In 1906, after she married her third husband, Charles Joseph Walker, she began calling herself Madam C.J. Walker. She also began selling an ointment called Madam Walker's Wonderful Hair Grower that became very popular. In 1908, she opened Lelia College of Beauty Culture, named after her daughter, to train sales agents to use her products. In 1910, she moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, where she built a factory. By 1911, her business was already so successful that she was able to make a $1,000 contribution to the local Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, for a new building. She moved to Harlem in 1916 and became involved in political activities, including the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's anti-lynching campaign. In 1917, she hosted one of the first large gatherings of American businesswomen when she convened her Madam C.J. Walker Beauty Culturist Union in Philadelphia. Walker developed an international business with customers all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. She provided jobs for African American women. Instead of being hired by someone else as maids and laundresses and farm workers, they were able to work for themselves and start their own businesses. When Walker died in 1919, she left more than $100,000 to political causes, organizations, and educational institutions. In 1998, she became the 21st African American to be featured in the United States Postal Service's Black Heritage Series. There now are two National Historic Landmarks, the Madam Walker Theater, a cultural arts center in Indianapolis, and Villa Lawaro, her Westchester County, New York mansion that bear her name. More than a century after she founded her company, the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, there is a line of products called MCJW for Madam C.J. Walker that's manufactured by Sundial Brands and sold throughout the United States. At the root of Walker's success was her belief in her high-quality products, her gift for marketing, and her ability to lead and inspire others. But as I was reading that, I thought, I just really want to get to questions, and I want to hear what you have to ask me. So, Letitia, should we start with questions now?
Yes, I think we should. I think that would be a great thing.
Great.
Ms. Gregg and Ms. Bundles, before we get to the pre-questions, a student keeps raising his hand, and I believe it's because he's excited about having read your book. So can we start with Michael Bass? Josh,
Yes.
can you meet him for us?
Hi, Michael.
Okay.
Ms. Bundles, it's very a pleasure to meet you. I have read one of your books that she was talking about earlier, Self-Made, the book about Madam C.J. Walker, but I haven't read the preview of your show on Netflix, the Self-Made one, but it's actually a very pleasure to meet you. I just wanted to say this. And yeah.
So if you've read Self-Made, you've read the big book and you know all the facts. So thank you very much. I'm so glad that you read it. And I think one of the things that that we should talk about is the difference between what you see in a movie and what you read in a book. And because you're reading Harry Potter, you know that even with something that's fictional, with a novel, which is a fictional book like Harry Potter, even those things are changed when they finally are translated from the page to the screen. There's even a bigger difference when you are reading a nonfiction book, a history book, or a biography, and when those characters are changed when they make it to the screen. So there is a lot in the Netflix series that actually didn't happen, and there are characters that are made up. They're fantasy characters or fabricated characters. So when you're seeing Self-Made, the movie, it's good to Google or read some of these fact versus fiction. What really happened, what didn't happen, because Hollywood script writers will often make decisions because they think it needs to be more dramatic or they want to hype it up a little bit. So it's really good to know the facts when you're watching a movie.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that. And thank you, Michael, for taking the initiative to read that book ahead of time. So you want to start with the questions, Ms. Bundles?
Sure, I'm
Okay.
ready. Do you want me to go through or will you ask them, Ms. Brooks? I'm ready with it, however you'd like to do it.
I have a few because we do have 2 fifth grade classes. So I have a few that are prepared, and then I guess I can read those and then we'll go off with the ones that you have already.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. So one of the questions from our 5th graders, how does it feel to have such an influential family member?
So, when I was growing up, my mother was really smart about not making it a big deal. So I never felt any pressure about having to live up to Madam Walker. We didn't sit around the dining room table saying, she did this, therefore you have to do that. My parents were really good about encouraging me to follow my own dreams and to see what I enjoyed doing. And what I really loved doing was writing. So that was what my parents encouraged me to do. And I became a journalist and had a long career in journalism, and I'm still now writing. But the beauty of this for me is that both of my parents worked in the hair care business. My mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, but she didn't pressure me to get into the business. I did this other thing that I wanted to do. But the beauty is that as I was learning to be a journalist, as I was learning to do research and learning to tell stories and doing stories about other people, I realized ultimately that one of the most interesting stories I could ever tell was the story about my family. And when I was in graduate school at the journalism school at Columbia, one of my professors recognized my name, Alelia, which has this unusual spelling, A''L''Elia. And she realized that I had a connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker. And she said, you need to write your master's paper about her. So my mother didn't make it a big deal. I really kind of lived my life doing the things that I felt passionate about. And then it was someone else who really validated it for me and who told me I needed to write about them. And now it's just a privilege to tell the story.
Thank you. And it's a privilege to listen to it. It's a privilege to be here and for you to share it with us. The next question. What made her so passionate about helping other Black women?
I think it's because in part she had been helped when she was really struggling. So she was born in Delta, Louisiana, 1867, the first child in her family to be born into freedom after the Civil War. And because she was orphaned at a very young age and then widowed at 20 with a young daughter, she was really struggling. She didn't have any formal education. But when she moved from Louisiana to St. Louis, where her older brothers were living, the only job she could get was as a washerwoman and as a maid. And she was embraced by the women of her church, who began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an uneducated woman. And these were women in the choir. She had a good enough singing voice that she was in the choir, women in the missionary society, and they really felt a responsibility to help the other women in their church who were moving to the cities and who didn't have a lot of skills. So eventually, when she began to become successful and she started recruiting sales agents, she could see herself in those women. She knew that they needed hair care products. They wanted something to solve some of their problems, but they also needed education and financial opportunity, financial independence. So she took some of the good things that had happened to her, and she was grateful for them, and turned around and helped other women. So it was really about seeing other women who looked like she had and wanting to give them opportunities.
Kind of like each one teach one. That's amazing.
Exactly.
For our next question, we have a 5th grader that's raising his hand, Ryan. So I'm going to unmute him and he can ask his question directly. Ryan?
So my question is so my question is about the Villa Luardo,
Mm-hmm.
and and why didn't it go to someone in the family? And my second question is, do you know what she used to make the hair products?
Sure. Great question. So Villa Lawaro, now I don't, some of you may actually have driven by Villa Lawaro, because when you go north on Broadway up Route 9, and if you've ever been to the Tappan Zee Bridge, then you will pass it on the left. So Villa Lawaro is the house that Madam Walker had built for her in 1918. And when in her will, she said that the house should go to her daughter when she died. And then after her daughter Alelia's death, she wanted it to be donated to the NAACP because she was so involved in their political activism. But when Alelia Walker died in 1931, it was in the midst of a really severe economic depression. And the cost of paying the taxes and repairing the house and doing the upkeep was so great that the NAACP realized that they couldn't really afford to take care of it. And so the house was sold to an organization called the Companions of the Forest. And this organization used it as a retirement home for their members for many, many years. The house was then bought by an individual named Ingo Appel, who owned it for about a decade. And then in 1993, it was bought by a man named Harold Doley, who was an investment banker, an African-American investment banker from New Orleans. And then he sold it to a foundation about 4 years ago. And this is a really sweet ending to the story for me, because the foundation was created by a man named Richelieu Dennis, who is using it as a think tank and a meeting place for women entrepreneurs, women of color entrepreneurs. And I'll just tell you a teeny bit about Richelieu before I answer your question about what was in the products. So Richelieu came to the United States from Liberia in the late 1980s. And he went to a college called Babson College in Wellesley, which is kind of like an undergraduate MBA, Masters of Business Administration. And when it was time for him to graduate, there was a war going on in Liberia, and his mom came for his graduation, but they could not go back home because of the war. And he was now a graduate from college, and he had wanted to go back to Liberia to start businesses, and he couldn't do that. So he and his mom and one of his friends took his grandmother's recipe for shea butter, and they started selling it on 125th and 5th Avenue. And then they have built it into a multi-billion-dollar business. And they make products, Shea Moisture and Nubian Heritage and the MCJW line. Mm-hmm. So Richelieu is an immigrant who has been a very successful entrepreneur, who then sold his company to Unilever, an international conglomerate, and took some of the money and bought Essence magazine, and then created the New Voices Fund for women, a venture capital fund for women of color entrepreneurs. And then his foundation bought Madam Walker's house. So this is full circle for me to have someone who cares so much about her legacy. I'm actually their historical consultant for the Walker product line. So I feel like my family is back and involved with it. So it's a happy ending for me. And I don't have to pay the taxes. So, so there's that.
That's even better.
Even better. Now, so for your second question, on what was in the product. So it's kind of hard. You have to imagine what life was like 100 years ago. So when most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing. So we take for granted that we can go in the kitchen and turn on the faucet, or that we can jump in the shower in the morning, but that wasn't the case. People used to have to go outside and pump the water, and they only bathed once a week. So it's kind of gross, so don't think about that too much. But they didn't wash their hair very often, and that meant they had really bad, if you think of the worst dandruff you've ever had and multiply it by 1,000. So they had a lot of bad scalp infections, and she was losing her hair. So really her secret was this: she encouraged women to wash their hair more often. She had a shampoo and then an ointment that was like Vaseline, but it had sulfur in it, and sulfur was kind of a medicinal agent that healed some of the sores on her scalp. Once her scalp was healthy, her hair began to grow back. So that was revolutionary 100 years ago. So now the new products, with 100 years worth of science and research and development and medical advances, we know that those heavy ointments were great then, but there are a lot of things that are better now that aren't as heavy. So there are now a lot of moisturizers and conditioners and exfoliants. So thank you for that question.
Wait. I have one more question.
Okay.
I promise. The last question. Was Madam C.J. Walker like financially reasonable? Did she just like, I know she invested, but as soon as she invested and started earning money, did she spend it, or did she right away save it?
That's another excellent question. You know, she enjoyed spending money. She liked very nice things, but she also enjoyed being a philanthropist. And while she didn't invest in the stock market, because the stock market was something that just kind of wasn't something she was doing, but she invested in real estate. She actually used to own the property where Central Park West is now, on Central Park Avenue. So she bought a lot of real estate. So that was one of the ways she invested. But she invested in people with her philanthropy by creating scholarships for others and by being involved in politically active. So yes, it was a combination of things.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, moving on to the next question. In the movie, it says that she was neighbors to John D. Rockefeller. Is that true?
Not exactly. That's one of those devices where a Hollywood script writer decides, what can I do that's really dramatic? So the real story is that her estate, Villa Lawaro, is really 5 miles away from John D. Rockefeller's home, Kykuit, Kykuit. So one day, some of you, if you haven't already been, you might, especially in the spring when it's nice, when you can actually go and we're not quarantined. It's a really beautiful place to visit, but it was really 5 miles away. And Madam Walker didn't really know John D. Rockefeller. She never met John D. Rockefeller. And the idea of her just strolling onto his lawn unannounced was really, really not something that was going to happen. But it was a Hollywood dramatic device to, I think, try to show that Madam Walker was making a statement about wanting to be a wealthy person.
Okay. Thank you. The next question we will take from a student, Zachary.
I never read one of your books, but maybe someday I might want to read one of your books, because I never read one of your books yet.
I will send some copies of my book to the school.
Okay.
So when you come back in the fall, or if you can come by in the summer, you can get it up.
Okay.
Thank you. We will appreciate that. Let's see. Is the school named after Layla still open?
So no, there are no Walker Beauty schools anymore. The last one closed in the 1970s. But the first school was in Pittsburgh, and then in Indianapolis, and then on 136th Street in New York. So in 1913, Madam Walker's daughter was managing their Pittsburgh office after she had moved to Indianapolis. and her daughter really liked the bright lights of New York and persuaded her mother that they needed to have a presence in Harlem in 1913 as Harlem was becoming the sort of Black cultural and political mecca. And she bought a building on 136th Street, not too far from Lenox Avenue, Malcolm X Boulevard, and had it remodeled by an architect named Bertner Tandy, who was the first licensed Black architect in New York, and then expanded it into a double townhouse. It was really a beautiful building. But that building was torn down in the 1940s, and it is now where the Countee Cullen branch of the public library is. So you know what the Schomburg that's at the corner of 135th and Lenox, and behind that is the Countee Cullen Library. That's where it was. And you know, earlier, actually last year, the street was renamed, that block of 136th Street between Lenox and 7th was renamed Madam C.J. Walker and A'Lelia Walker Place.
Can I ask a question? So you mentioned that street. Can you tell us about the Dark Tower? Take a little detour from the beauty industry and talk about
Absolutely.
this.
So when Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker both really loved the arts, really loved music, culture, theater, painting, books. And when they were, Stephen, this is a little bit of a long answer, but I want to help people understand why they loved it so much. When they were still very poor and living in St. Louis, there was a lot of music around them. For a while, when they were in a really dire straits, across the alley from their apartment was a cafe called Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe. And that's where Scott Joplin, who was one of the inventors of ragtime, that's where he played. So they were hearing that music. The church that they went to was a new church in the Black community, and it had an organ, a state-of-the-art organ. And the organist and the choir director was also the principal of one of the elementary schools that Lelia went to. And the children in the schools were learning music. Now, the schools were segregated, so there were Black schools and white schools, but the German immigrants who had come to St. Louis in the 1830s and 1840s brought their music. So the music curriculum included German lieder and opera, and the students were learning that. And many of the principals of the Black schools had gone to Oberlin, and many of them had studied music. So this combination of the German immigrants and the African-American migrants who had come from the South were interspersing their music. And so Lelia and Sarah were exposed to music, and they really loved it. So that when they eventually had some money and could entertain, they always brought live music into their homes for their parties. And that was a real bond between mother and daughter. And then after Madam Walker died in 1919, A'Lelia was struggling because she missed her mother, and other people were comparing her to her mother, and she wasn't quite the businesswoman that her mother was. And she was trying to figure out, what is it what mark can I leave? And because she loved culture so much, she talked with some friends, and she decided that what she would do was to convert a floor of her home, her townhouse on 136th Street, into a cultural salon called the Dark Tower. And that was a place that became very much a meeting place for all of the writers and artists and musicians and actors and European royalty and African diplomats who came to her parties and enjoyed music and enjoyed poetry readings. So Steve, that was a really long answer, but I think that I know that that culture is very much a part of the education that students get at Harlem Link. And it can lead to so much about one's expressing oneself and learning things, and that it really can make a mark on your life when you learn about music and art.
Great, thank you. I know you mentioned there were some questions that you really liked. I was hoping you would be able to answer some of those questions now.
Okay, so let me see. Some of them, why Madam Walker was passionate about helping other Black women was one that I loved. Oh, why did the lady from the Netflix movie hate your great-grandmother so much? So here's where we get to the fact and fiction part. In real life, Madam Walker had a competitor whose name was Annie Malone. And in real life, Annie Malone had started a company, and Madam Walker, Sarah Breedlove, worked for her for about a year and a half and sold her products. And then they had a falling out, and I don't know exactly why, but Sarah decided she wanted to start her own company. She wanted to do her own thing, which she did. And then they became rivals. But in real life, Annie Malone was also a very successful entrepreneur, a pioneer of the hair care industry, a philanthropist, a person who employed thousands of women. So they were kind of like, I don't know, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. You know, they were both successful people. But the Hollywood scriptwriter, in trying to do what Hollywood does, which is to find conflict and make that the centerpiece of the story, decided that she would kind of really alter the real life character. She changed the name slightly to Addie Monroe. And she made up a lot of stuff that I really wish she hadn't done, because I think it gives the wrong impression about both women. But she wanted to do something with colorism, you know, this idea of lighter skin is more prestigious than darker skin. And so she made this Addie Monroe character, a lighter skinned woman, and used that as a way to put down Sarah. That didn't really happen in real life. Annie Malone never moved into Indianapolis, didn't follow her. So this is really a Hollywood device that I think the writer didn't take very much responsibility, because it's had a pretty negative effect on the people who really care a lot about Annie Malone. So they were real rivals, they were real competitors. That part was real, but the real details of that didn't really happen. Okay, so let's see. Why did she change her name to Madam C.J. Walker? So her name was Sarah Breedlove when she was born. And her first husband's name was Moses McWilliams. So she became Sarah McWilliams. And he died when she was 20. And then after she moved to St. Louis, she married another man named John Davis. So then she was Sarah Breedlove McWilliams Davis. And then they didn't get along. He had some flaws that she didn't like, so they split up. And then her good friend Charles Joseph Walker, who was a newspaper man and knew something about advertising, moved to Denver after she had left St. Louis, and they got married. And she started in her ads calling herself Mrs. C.J. Walker. And then she added the Madam, because that was, you know, kind of a bit of an affectation, you know, a little bit fancy, to make herself fancy, because Paris, where people called people Madame, was the center of fashion and cosmetics, and she wanted to identify with that beauty industry. But there's also one other little piece to that, and that is, you know, in that first generation after slavery, there was a lot of racism, and often Black women would be called by their first names, even when somebody didn't really know them, but it was a way of kind of putting them down. And Sarah Breedlove Walker did not want somebody disrespecting her. So she said, if I'm Madam C.J. Walker, they don't know my first name, they have to treat me with respect. So some of it was her putting a stake in the ground and saying, you will respect me. So Ms. Gregg, is there something else you want to ask from your end? I'll keep looking at my list.
I think we'd like to open up the floor to some of our fifth graders that are on the Zoom call. So fifth graders, if you have some questions, can you just raise your hand, and me or Mr. Josh will unmute you so you can ask your question directly. All right, maybe they're a little shy right now.
I see Brianna's hand up.
Brianna, okay. Okay.
Love your glasses.
Thank you.
Okay, Brianna, you can ask your question.
Was it just Hollywood, or was your mother really LGBT? And did your mother die from a bad diet? Your grandmother.
So I missed the very first part you said. Was my mother really what?
LBGT.
Oh, no. No, not as far as we can tell. Those are really good questions. So I'll answer about the bad diet. This was an interesting thing when I was reading the script. I had what was called script review, that was with the contract that I had after my book was optioned, but it meant I could read the scripts before they started filming, but they didn't necessarily have to take my suggestions. They took some of my suggestions and they ignored some of my suggestions. And when the head writer said she wanted to make the story more modern, and I'm thinking she's trying to appeal to young audiences. And one of the things that she decided to do was to give Madam Walker an eating disorder, which didn't really happen. I mean, she had high blood pressure and hypertension, and so she needed to adjust her diet. But things were very different then. And this binge, I don't know, it was really kind of subtle when you saw it on the screen that she was binge eating. But that didn't happen. That was really the writer kind of projecting onto her what she thought would be the way she would handle stress, because some people handle stress that way. So that really didn't happen. And was Lelia, my great grandmother, was she LGBT? So not with any real evidence. I mean, many of her friends were queer, and she was very comfortable inviting people into her home and having a really wide range of friends. And many people who were very much a part of the Harlem Renaissance were queer, and that was fine with her. The real conflict between mother and daughter was not over a person like Esther, who really was a made-up character, again, a device that the script writer thought needed to be included. And you have to ask her why she thought it was necessary to make that character up. Because in real life, the conflict between Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker was really over two boyfriends. They were both handsome, they were both doctors, and Madam Walker was suspicious of one who was this really handsome guy named Dr. Wiley Wilson. What a name. And the other one was Dr. James Arthur Kennedy, who they called Jack Kennedy, who also was called Gentleman Jack. So there were these two boyfriends, both handsome, both doctors, one kind of a bad boy and one a really good guy. And her mother was very suspicious of the bad boy and really was trying to not interfere with her daughter's life, but she didn't really want her to marry him. And the book that I'm writing now is about A'Lelia Walker and her life in Harlem during the 1920s, especially. And one of the things that one of the stories I tell is that when Madam Walker was on her deathbed at Villa Lawaro, and they knew that her kidneys were failing, she wasn't going to survive, she had sent Lelia and my grandmother to South America so Lelia could develop a new market. And part of it was to get her away from the boyfriends. And while she was gone, she wrote a letter to her mother and she said, I have decided to marry Kennedy, the good guy, and not Wiley. And her mother was ecstatic. And she wrote her a letter on May 16th, 1919, the last letter she'd ever write. And she said, I'm so happy about this. And she talked about her plans, what you should do for the wedding. And then she died after she had brought the good guy to her bedside. Lelia and my grandmother get back to New York, and Kennedy, the good guy, has been separated from his wife for many years, but isn't divorced. And so Lelia is distraught and just really needs to connect. And so on June 3rd, she marries Dr. Wiley Wilson. And then on June 6th, her 34th birthday, as she had buried her mother. And so then eventually she married Dr. Kennedy. So that was the real conflict.
Great, thank you. Great question, Brianna. For our next question, we're going to go to Jewel, who is a 4th grader.
To ask you a question. They said, so what's the host say your name?
Mama, my question is, did
Do they still sell Madam C.J. Walker's hair products?
I love your background, by the way. Yes, so yes, the products are still sold, and they are sold at Sephora.com. Let me see if I'm going to turn around and grab one for you. Here's one right here. Let's see. This is called Brand New. This is a conditioner. So these products are manufactured by Sundial Brands and sold at Sephora.com.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Jewel. Next we'll go to Layson, who is a 5th grader.
Okay, so I have 2 questions, and my first question is, do you remember a significant conversation with your mom? What did it teach you?
So yes, so I'll just give you the family tree because it's confusing because there are 3 Alelias. There was Madam C.J. Walker, and then her daughter was Alelia Walker, but really Alelia McWilliams, and then she just started using her stepfather's last name, even though she was not adopted by him. And then she actually adopted my grandmother, whose name was May, Fairy May Bryant. And there's a long story about how they came to know Fairy May's family. But she ultimately, they promised they would educate her. They sent her to Spelman, and then she became president of the company. And so my grandmother, Fairy May, who was known as May, who's at the end of the film, had my mother, whose name was Alelia May Perry. And then my parents named me Alelia Perry Bundles. So each generation has one name from the previous generation. But my mother was really instrumental in me just having confidence and being able to do the things that were important to me. And when I was in graduate school and starting to write about Madam Walker, this was the fall of 1975, my mom was really sick and she had lung cancer. And when I went home from New York to Indianapolis for Christmas vacation, she was in the hospital. And I had a long conversation with her and I said, I'm starting to do this research for this paper I'm writing. And I'm finding that this little paragraph that essentially was Madam Walker was born on a plantation, orphaned at 7, married at 14, and a widow at 20, started a hair care company, became a millionaire, that little paragraph was not enough, that there were other things going on. And there were some things that I said, there were divorces, and should I talk about these? And nothing really real scandalous, but I just didn't know, what should I do about that? And my mother in her hospital bed leaned forward and said to me, "Tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth." And that gave me permission to be able to talk about this, to not feel any shame about whatever obstacles or difficulties any of them had. So that was really important for me to hear that from my mom.
Wow. Okay, my second question is, how has being the daughter of the late Madam C.J. Walker affected your life, and how do you carry the past journey?
So it's affected my life in this way, that I get to tell the story, but I get to tell the story in a way that's comfortable for me. If I had been forced to work in the family business, I think I probably would have resented it because it wasn't my passion. So my mother saw that and said, "Go do the thing that you want to do." So then I was able to circle back around and really find the way that I was most comfortable with this story. And being able to have developed my own career and had my own accomplishments as a journalist made a difference, because it gave me some esteem, some self-esteem, and some self-confidence that I was doing things that were on my own and not because I was related to somebody who was famous or who had a lot of accomplishments. But now it's, as I say, it's just really a privilege to be able to tell this story, because Madam Walker's life inspires so many other people. And I will tell you that it crosses a wide range of people. So I have spoken to students, international students at Harvard's Business School, who are studying Madam Walker's life and finding about her marketing secrets and seeing how it applies to the businesses that they want to start or the things that they want to do. And I've also talked to women who are at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, who read my book in their college class and who asked questions that were just as good, if not better, than the students at Harvard Business School. So Madam Walker's life really a lot of people can find ways to be inspired by her and to find something that lifts them up. And so, and you said in keeping the legacy, you know, it's not something when you couldn't have told me when I was your age that one of the main things I'd be doing in my life was telling Madam Walker's story. I just wanted to be a kid and do the things that kids do. But I have seen the power of this story. And so I try very hard to tell her story, whether it's in books or speeches, on my social media pages. You know, I write a lot about her. I write on my websites. So it's knowing that people all over the world now, as a result of the Netflix series, even though there were some things that weren't true and things that were made up and things I would have done differently, I was hearing from, I mean, tons of people in Brazil. My Instagram account was full of Portuguese that I had to translate, but people were excited about her. So I feel like I'm leaving a legacy by telling her story.
Okay, thank you so much. It was an honor speaking to you.
An honor to speak with you as well.
Thank you, Layson. Our next question is going to come from another fifth grader, Peyton.
Okay, so my question is there anything that wasn't mentioned in the movie Self-Made that you would have wanted to be mentioned or brought up at any point?
Great question. That was one of the ones that I had highlighted. So I'm glad that you asked it. If I were doing this, and if there's a sequel, if I get another pass at this, the things that I would emphasize would be her relationship with other women, the women who really helped her. I would have a composite character who was one of her mentors, because I think the women who reached out to her in the beginning when it wasn't clear that she was going to be anything other than a washerwoman are the relationships that were most important to her. Mm-hmm. I would have done a lot more with her attorney, F.B. Ransom. He was in the film, but he's kind of a minor character, and he was really instrumental in allowing her to be on the road. He sort of crossed the T's and dotted the I's so she could be a visionary and she could travel. So I would have done more with him. There is a character that is described as his cousin called Sweetness, who is a numbers runner. And I didn't like that character who was made up because Mr. Ransom was a straight arrow, a law-abiding guy who would never have bet on the numbers. And so I thought it kind of gave the impression that he was doing something illegal and that there had to be some kind of shady money that was part of an investment for the Walker Company when that didn't happen. So I would have left that part out. And then I would have included more about her political activism. She was very good friends with Ida B. Wells, who was the big anti-lynching activist. And I would have included that relationship. And then I would have shown more of her philanthropy. There's this really, what I think is a great line in the film saying, I want to be, bigger than Carnegie and Rockefeller put together or something like that. So that's a really great line in the script, but that didn't really happen. And what Madam Walker really said, she knew being a millionaire and sort of striving for that was an important marker in America, in a capitalist society, to be able to say African Americans and women can succeed in financially. But what she also said was, I love to use a part of what I make to help others. And at her 1917 convention, she gave prizes to the delegates who sold the most products, but who also gave the most to charity. And she told the women at the convention, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. So her real motivation, she wanted to make money, but ultimately her motivation was, what could I do to help my community?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Peyton. That was a great question. So Ms. Bundles, I'm just gonna open it up to you. Is there anything else that you wanted to address with the questions or anything else you wanted to share with us?
Well, I think that I'm so glad to get this chance to talk with the students, and I hope that we'll have another chance to come back to this after I send the book. Maybe next semester they will have, after they've read the book, there will be some additional questions that they have. And then I'm working on another book about the Harlem Renaissance. So if you do a Harlem Renaissance curriculum, I'd love to be able to, to come talk about that as well. But I think, especially for Madam Walker's life, to be able to see the struggles that she had and that she was able to overcome the doubt that other people had in her. People wrote her off, and they thought, she said that when she first started out, people said, you'll never make your train fare from one town to another. But she could see that she was making a difference, and she knew others had helped her. And so she wanted to keep pushing forward. She was a marketing genius. I think she'd be on Instagram if she were living now. She understood the power of images and of self-confidence. She also was very good about surrounding herself with other talented, competent people. I think one of the reasons that she is more remembered than some of her competitors is that she made some really wise decisions about hiring the attorney that she hired and allowing him to do what he did best. She was always interested in lifelong learning because she had not had a lot of formal education. She was what was considered a self-taught woman, but she had help from others. The woman who she hired to be the manager of her factory had been a dean of girls at a boarding school, at a Black boarding school in Kentucky. And that woman in many ways became her tutor. One of the story, her secretary who went to work for her in 1914 when she was a teenager was still working for the company when I was growing up, and was one of my key sources for learning about Madam Walker. And she told me two stories. One is that because Madam Walker traveled so much, she was not in the office that often, but on the days or the weeks when she was in Indianapolis, all of the office girls would just want to be around her, just want to hear her stories and see what they could learn. And they would read the newspaper together every morning. And if somebody didn't understand a word that was in the paper, then in the newspaper, they would all go to the dictionary together and look up the word. Because she said there was no shame in not understanding something. You don't make fun of somebody if they don't understand something. Let's learn this together. Let's help each other. And then there was one letter that she and her attorney wrote to each other almost every day when she was traveling. And there was one letter where he wrote to her and he said, the next time you are in Indianapolis, we have to go to the bank because your signature card for when you write checks, your handwriting has improved so much that the bank is not sure it's you writing those $1,000 checks. So she always wanted to keep getting better. And then I will just, Ms. Grizz, I will just leave you with, some words from Madam Walker. And she said that people often asked her the secret to her success. And she would say to them, there is no royal flower-strewn path to success. And if there is, I have not found it. For whatever success I have attained has been the result of much hard work and many sleepless nights. I got my start by giving myself a start. So don't sit down and wait for the opportunities to come. You have to get up and make them for yourself.
That was amazing.
Wow.
Thank you. Yes, we're going to pass it off to Mr. Evangelista.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you again because you've given us so many amazing life lessons just by telling the story and interpreting the story of your great-grandmother. I mean, I think there's a lifelong set of ideas to unpack that you've given us just in the last hour.
Great.
So I'm amazed at what a wealth of information. Never mind the monetary wealth that she built up despite all the obstacles that were put in front of her and people telling her that she wouldn't succeed and all the things you described, but the legacy that she's left. So I very much appreciate it. And I misspoke earlier, I apologize. The students you addressed a few years ago are now 9th graders. They are in high school.
9th grade, okay.
We will keep you posted on them. They are doing amazing things. Mrs. Van Auken is on the call here and she's keeping up with them very carefully. We'll let you know how they're doing with some details to keep you linked to them. So I just want to say thank you. And if any of the other administrators want to chime in with a closing thought, please do. And we will definitely accept your offer of sending us some of the books because we have insatiable appetites for reading at our school and for history as well.
Excellent.
I wanted to thank Ms. Bundles. Thank you again for coming. It has been an honor engaging with you today. I also wanted to thank our 5th grade teachers and students for coming prepared with some really thoughtful questions. And we also have some 4th grade and 1st grade teachers who mentioned that you were going to be a guest for our 5th graders, and some of those students came along as well. So I wanted to recognize them and just, again, thank you for coming into our community today.